All right. Well, welcome back, everyone, for another exciting episode of Time for Forgiveness. And thank you so much for tuning in to Time for Forgiveness. I want to just remind you here, if you have questions or a topic you would like us to cover on a future episode, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you through our website, timeforforgiveness.org. Also, be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube and follow us along on our social media pages on Instagram and Facebook, also at Time for Forgiveness. We are also always looking for guest submissions. So if you have a story you'd like to share about your own personal journey through forgiveness, reach out to us again on our website. All right. Well, today we're very excited to welcome in a special guest. And again, it's Father Don Farnan. Say hello, Father.
Hello, listeners. It's good to be back again and good to continue the conversation. And that conversation often leads us to different ways of thinking, exploring different areas. And I think today we're going to explore a little bit about forgiveness through grief and how all of us experience both grief and forgiveness. So how we can better relate and how we can go through those to get to better places.
And I think, Father, like you said, what a more important, I believe, conversation, because grief is universal and forgiveness is universal. And the two of them coming together and mixing those, I'm really excited to bring Fran on. I think she's going to have a lot of perspective on really some amazing tools that have maybe helped people get moving through both of those. Okay, listeners, we have such a special guest with us today. Her name is Fran Solomon, and as an entrepreneur, visionary, developer, and executor, Fran Solomon is the founder of HealGrief, virtual platform serving the bereaved. Everything they do works towards fostering healthy post-bereavement growth. Programs include Let's Talk Death, Loss Project, Actively Moving Forward, and the AMF App, a way for grieving individuals to communicate with others having a similar experience because they, too, are grieving a death loss. In addition, the app members have access to tools, resources, and virtual support groups. Fran, could you just open it up and share with the listeners your vision or this idea and how you created this?
Right, Fran, you know what, as Kelly's asking, I think what would be very helpful for the listeners is to get a little backdrop on what you personally went through and how HealGrief was kind of born through your own personal experience of not only grief, but talking about, forgiveness and how you kind of moved into the space eventually.
Well, that could take up the whole show, and I would be happy to. So I actually do not come anywhere close to the field of bereavement care, nor am I a licensed clinician. Truly, my entry into this field is from a personal experience. When back in '98, my father died, and he was really my first significant death loss. And at the time, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. I grieved through the funeral. Sunday night came along. I had to get ready for Monday's work. And I put my grief in a box, tucked a bow on it, put it up on the shelf, and went through the list of cliches. Time will heal. I'll get over it. Life will move on, so on and so forth. And that worked for a while. Fast forward. I was fortunate enough to have a beautiful, beautiful daughter enter my life. And the challenge for me was that this beautiful life that entered mine brought me so much sadness. And I didn't understand this sadness. And I was very lucky. I had a dear friend sit with me and said, Fran, what's up? And as a new mother, I'm going through the list of all the reasons why I was so sad. And I've learned that human nature kind of suggests that the last thing you vent about is usually the most pressing on your soul. And so all of a sudden I went into tears and I said, And my dad's not here to see the one thing he wanted more than anything in the world, a granddaughter. That was a gift, because had I not had that aha moment, my sadness might have been very displaced on her presence in my life. But through that experience, I was really able to identify that my sadness was not over this beautiful life that entered mine. It was about my father not being here to be present with me, enjoying his granddaughter. So it so happens that this girlfriend of mine worked for a local nonprofit grief support center. And through my aha moment, I wanted to get involved, and I went to the grief support center, actually supporting her. And the center had different rooms. They had a littles room, a teens room, an adult room where they provide grief support. And I went into the teens room, and they had just finished a project, a collage. And if you think about a collage, there's pictures on top of pictures on top of pictures on top of pictures. There was one collage that had 3 images on it. It was a picture of a young adolescent boy with his mother, a huge picture of lips, and the word time from Time magazine cut out. And the story goes, his story goes, this is me and my mom. The more time that goes on, the more I miss her lips kissing me. And that was it for me. I said, sign me up. I'm in, and I trained with them to be a facilitator. I worked with high school students in underserved communities, helping them process their own grief. I realized through that process, I was a little young in my journey of grief. I had put it on a shelf for so long, and now the box was now being opened. That bow came off, and I was now just learning to process my own grief. So after a few months of that, I had to take a back seat, and I got involved on the agency's board. I was part of the agency for about 10 years. And through my tenure, I would have people reaching out to me from all different walks of my past lives. So-and-so died, what do we say? So-and-so died, how do we help them? The kids are struggling. And as an insider, it was mind-boggling to me that there were no resources available to offer for people to get this support. They were very far and few between. So really, that became the birth of HealGrief, which started out as a virtual website where people can go and find resources for their own journey to healing. And in my research, I found so many wonderful sites, and so I kind of put them all together in what I hope people will find to be the best of the best insofar as resources, insofar as information, insofar as tools to guide one's journey with grief into what we call a healthy post-bereavement growth. And then years into this HealGrief project, we started working with young adults, a challenging demographic to serve, especially those that are grieving and bereaved. And so in working with young adults, we realized that we had to do things differently. They wanted to be connected on a more global network, digitally and 24/7, which gave us the task to fulfill, and we came up with an actively moving forward app. And I think that's a long-winded answer to your question. So I just want to pause there and see if there's any questions in that journey thus far.
Yes, this is Father Don, and I just wanted to ask about stages of grief, just as we have stages of forgiveness, and I know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has done some things on the stages of grief. But tell me, Fran, in your experience, is there a proper way to grieve? Are there steps that everybody ought to go through? I mean, I think that the conventional wisdom is that everybody grieves differently. and probably a lot of it has to do with their age in life, the relationship that they had with the loved one, many factors. But what is your sense? Is it more that there are proper stages to follow, going from the place of extreme hurt to a place where you can get up each day and function well? Or can we just say that everybody grieves differently and whatever, let's toss out method and toss out stages and just let people grieve in the ways that they need to?
So, Father, that's a great question. And although I know that there's a taught manual, the 5 stages of grief, it is our experience that everyone grieves differently. And as a matter of fact, HealGrief, as its philosophy, dismisses the notion of stages. Just a bit of information your listeners may not know. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did her research on those who were dying. It became adopted for those who are grieving a death loss. And even in her life prior to her death, she made it very clear that her research was on the dying. So although it's still taught as stages in grief, and although I believe that these stages do happen in one's grief journey, I feel we're doing an injustice advocating for stages, because we have had people share with us, well, I went through all the stages. I did the first stage, the second stage, the third stage, but then I ended up back to the first stage. Am I grieving wrong? No. You're not grieving wrong.
Well, I sure appreciate you making those distinctions, Fran, because I think many people out there are asking the same questions. Am I grieving right? Is something wrong with me because I feel this way? Or people are telling me how I ought to feel, and I just don't feel that right now.
Yeah, and if people go through these 5 stages, the conclusion is, I'm supposed to be done with grieving. When in fact, we believe grieving is a lifelong journey. That doesn't mean that someone is in grief every moment of the day. But we do believe that there are life cycles that trigger grief and evoke the emotions of grief as if they were yesterday.
Right. Well, in that, when I think about Fran, even with forgiveness, I think generally people know that it's healing and it's a positive thing to be able to forgive. But yet, for whatever reason, sometimes people are not able to forgive, or they don't want to forgive at some point in time. And so how do you see let's just say sudden death, for example, how do you see forgiveness playing into that process with people that are bereaving, but then at the same time, based on what might have happened, there's a sense of that they need to forgive themselves for something maybe they didn't do or take advantage of, why that person was here. Do you know where I'm going with that a little bit?
I do, Robert, and there are so many stories. If only I knew. If only I did this, that wouldn't have happened. If only we went a different direction. How did I not see the signs? Not only forgiveness, but guilt.
Right.
So many people experience guilt. We've heard, I decided it was more important to go to this party when I should have been there because they were saying they weren't well, or I should have taken that trip. I didn't know it was the last time I would see them. So living with that guilt and how do you move on from that is really a challenge for many people. And one of the first things that we invite someone to be open to when they share expressions of guilt is we ask them to be kind to themselves. They didn't know what they didn't know. It's not like someone said, this is going to be the last time you're going to see this person. And it was a cognitive, dismissive, no, I'm not going to. We don't know what we don't know. We can only act on the information we know, and for many, we presume there's going to be tomorrow.
Fran, I've been just studying and just expanding my understanding and knowledge of just forgiveness and grief. And I was reading this book, and it really caught my attention because it said movement forward starts when we change our reaction to it. And I know it did for me because I can really resonate with what you said. There's so much guilt around grief and forgiveness, and it is being kind to yourself. But I think it's also maybe finding a new meaning of how this could serve me, or what can I take from this and bring good out of it. Did you experience any of that in regards to this idea with actively moving forward?
Yeah, so actively moving forward really is the words that we use. How do you actively move forward in grief or with guilt? Or how do you live life again? For many who come to our community, it's because they're deeply grieving. And when I say deeply grieving, we believe the deeper the love, the deeper the grief. And we don't place any discrimination on relationship because it's not for us to place judgment. If you love someone deeply, whether they're a sibling, a friend, a parent, an aunt, a grandparent, if you're grieving deeply, you loved deeply, and you still love deeply. I shouldn't even make that past tense. Just because a person is not here in physical presence doesn't mean that they're vanished from our minds, and they certainly haven't left our heart. So it's taking that grief and actively moving forward with it. Many of the themes that we hear when someone is grieving are a sense of isolation, a sense of nobody gets it, nobody understands, and a wanting, a desire to connect with others who do. So that's what Heal Grief and the Actively Moving Forward app does. We connect people so they feel less alone and less isolated in their grief, and they're able to connect with other people who do understand. So in our community, you may have several individuals that may be feeling this connection because they did something else instead of listening to the signs because they thought there was going to be a tomorrow and didn't act on those signs. Or perhaps they feel if only they did something else, this accident wouldn't have happened. One of the things that we haven't touched on is suicide. So many people believe they should have seen the signs. And so they're living with, I could have stopped it. And how do you relieve yourself from that guilt? So it really is about the kindness and forgiving, not only forgiving your person for certain steps that they may have taken that might have led to their death, but also forgiving yourself, again, for not knowing what you didn't know.
Fran, do you mind speaking a little bit about the grief through death and how we honor the loved one who has died? I often, and this is kind of a self-critique, and I guess I'm wanting to get your opinion on the way that I function as a priest, but I will often say to people that the best way that we can honor someone, and I say this by way of getting from the place of grief that gives life to something wonderful and beautiful, is by honoring that person in what they did. If it's an older person, they've dedicated their life to certain things. They have characteristics we sometimes call eulogy virtues because we talk about their goodness at the end of their life. And the greatest way we can honor them is to adopt some of those virtues and continue on their works. If it's a young person, we often think that they didn't get to complete so much, and they have such a potential. and had great ideals. And even if it was someone who took their own life because they were angry at themselves, or whatever the whole emotional mental thing was, maybe they were not in they were in a place of darkness rather than a place of light. They still were filled with goodness and had great hopes for the world, and had potential to really create something wonderful. So the best way that we can honor them is to finish what they could not do. They didn't get the chance to do, or they didn't have the ability or the capacity at that time to see it. So I guess my question is, am I in the right direction, do you think, in helping people to get through grief and the loss of a loved one by honoring that person, by continuing their works?
Actively moving forward in their memory, yes. I'm also going to add to all the things that you mentioned about following through with their legacy. One of the things that we ask our members in groups is, what is the one, maybe two things you love the most about your person, and how are you going to live that? Really gives them an opportunity to think about their person and the things they love the most. And we've had some of our members really transform some of the way they do things. And one said, my father would walk in a room and everyone would laugh, because he was just, not that he would be laughed at, but he just had such wit about him. And so she said, I'm going to try and develop the wit that my father had. And that just goes further into the conversation, that now every time she tries to do that and fulfills being witty, she's honoring her father, and she can think about her father with a smile on her face.
What an
Someone else had
incredible tribute to someone, to just think, I'm going to make the world a little bit happier because of the happiness that he brought to me and the way he lit up a room and people were smiling because of it. That's wonderful.
Exactly. Another young adult that we had a mother who just couldn't read enough. And so what she did on her social media was she asked all of her friends to gather books and donate them to their local library in memory of her mom.
No, that's really cool.
Well, again,
there are so many ways we can do this.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I think of C.S. Lewis, who said that we read to know that we're not alone. And this whole sense of this lady who loved to read, and how her child is now spreading that word for all these other people to know that they are not alone also, and getting books to others, and maybe even in some communities that don't have a lot of opportunities for literacy or reading. And again, it's like a pebble in a pond, but the ripple gets bigger and bigger, and that's a great tribute to someone.
Exactly. And then there's other ways as well. For example, if somebody's person died of cancer, perhaps creating a cancer walk, fundraising cancer walk in honor of their person. There's power in community.
Hey, Fran, I want to ask you in regards to community, when someone is going through grief, and it is a universal thing and there's loss all around us, but some individuals may have not experienced it the way they did. And then you hear comments, like you said, that they feel isolated, alone, misunderstood. Maybe individuals don't really feel comfortable and they don't know what to say. So maybe they say something that is somewhat offensive or taken the wrong way. And this individual that is grieving is feeling just misunderstood and feels like, it's inconvenienced for those around them to even talk about it or share. And so they really kind of start forming a sense of somewhat of anger and frustration. And then we're talking about, layering in this idea of forgiving those around them that they really don't know how to support them. What would you say to them?
Yeah. I would say to the person who is grieving, to, as difficult as it may be, understand that most people around them may not have their experience. And until you've had the experience, I don't think one can understand the depth of grief and what that means. An example, years ago, a girlfriend of mine, her father, her brother died within a year of each other. I had not had an experience with a death loss of a significant person in my life yet. And every year when she was reminiscing, I would be thinking to myself, when is she going to get over this? Until I had the experience of grieving someone significant in my life. Mm-hmm. And today, if only I could go back in time and be more compassionate and be present to hold that space for her. For those in your audience that are listening who may not have had the grief experience, we hear through our members that the biggest gift can be to just be present. Not by saying, call me if you need something, but by physically going and saying, let me take you out for a cup of coffee, or let's go for a walk. It can be in silence, just being present. And do not avoid the conversation of someone wanting to talk about their person. That is part of the healing process, sharing that story over and over again. We suggest no comparison. Everybody's grief is different. Everybody's grief is unique. But being present with that person is just so significant. And I'll share another little story. A friend of mine whose child died years ago. I remembered her daughter's birthday. And I just said, just want you to know, I remember your daughter's birthday today. You know what? We're talking about Mother's Day coming up and Father's Day coming up, and I hope I'm not dating the podcast. But it's not only for mothers who have children. It's for mothers. Edit that part out. It's not only for the child to honor their mother. What about the mothers whose child is no longer with them? They're still a mother.
Right.
Reaching out to them and saying, Happy Mother's Day may evoke emotions, may evoke tears, but my experience is that it's also going to be a moment where my child wasn't forgotten.
Yeah, sometimes we stumble over ourselves, don't we? We unintentionally, we will say things that are just not very mindful of the whole situation, maybe don't read a situation well, or as you have said, we can't know what we don't know, and sometimes people might say something not knowing that the mother has lost a child. I think it is also valuable for people to remember that other people want to express their goodness. And they want opportunities to express the goodness. And at a time of loss, even in our awkwardness and our fumbling around, we're trying to do and say the right things, but often we mess up on it. And I know it sometimes causes more pain. There might be just, and you mentioned some of these, Fran, just little things that people can do or say. One that is very simple, and you've hit on it, is just to be present, and you don't need to say anything. And then there are times when instead of trying to come up with words to say that are consoling, we just say, I'm sorry. And I think sometimes less is more. So just that ministry of presence and that ministry of being there is valuable. And as you've indicated, sometimes we'll say, well, if there's anything that I can do for you, I'm not sure that's the right thing to say. I mean, it's the right sentiment to have, but most people
Yes.
are not going to respond to anything that you can do for me. But
Just do it.
right,
Yeah.
you
If know
take
something
over
you
a
can
case
do,
of
just do it.
water, you
Right.
take over paper products, you bring over food, you just show up, and you just do things, and that is part of that ministry of presence.
Well, thank goodness that God's mercy doesn't stop at our human limitations, right, Father? That He can see for us in things that, because of our senses, we're not aware that those things are present.
That's right, and just letting God work through us at times, just like we said with forgiveness. Sometimes we can't forgive, but God can forgive through us. God is in us, and we can still love. So in the ways that we love, even in our ineptness at it, it's an expression that is good.
Because, Fran, what you're offering your audience is, in essence, for them to keep their faith and to keep their courage, correct? Because those are two emotions that they need to be able to draw upon to get through a lot of challenges that happen, especially in sudden death and sudden grief, correct?
Yeah, it's funny you say the word strength. We often hear members say, well, they told me I need to be strong. And strong usually implies to be stoic and to move on. For us, we present a twist to being strong. We believe that strength is in feeling, that strength is in vulnerability, that strength is in allowing oneself to grieve in order to go through the process to have a healthy post-bereavement growth, to find things to live for, to find ways to honor our persons, to have our tears of sadness turn into smiles as we reminisce about them. So strength for us is a bit differently than what most people perceive the meaning to be.
Well, Robert had said, that you're really moving individuals just to hold faith and to have courage. But I know one of the big words that you guys use is offering hope and asking the participants on your calls for the hope of the week. And in my idea, the hope is, that tomorrow can be better. Did you start that, or how did that form? Because I think it's just a beautiful thing to really cause you to look for the good and to pay attention to what you are hopeful for.
Yeah, absolutely. Kelly, great question. So we hold groups several times a week. They're all virtual groups. Groups can be specific to a type of loss, insofar as a relationship to their person, whether it's a child loss, a parental loss, spousal loss, so on and so forth. It can be general, where different types of relationships are mixed. As our tradition with every group, we close group with a hope. And for us, it's an intentional cognitive shift in that here we are for a good hour together, and we're often talking about despair and such heavy grief. We never want to leave our community just feeling despair and just hopeless. So based on the conversation, the group's conversation, we always ask our members, based on today's group, what hope might you have for yourself or for the group? And we see some beautiful, beautiful things expressed, beautiful words expressed from this hope that people share. And it leaves people hopeful out of the despair that they're sharing for their time with us.
Well, certainly from a religious viewpoint, and I kind of toss this into our little episodes, whether it's wanted or not, but there are a few listeners out there that like to tie things into religion. We talk about Good Friday and we talk about Easter Sunday, and they really can't be separated. That is the crucifixion and the resurrection. They're part of the same thing. But if you just stop at Good Friday, we just stop at the death, whether it's the funeral wake or the burial, it is quite despairing. But I appreciate your saying that that's not where we end up. That's not where we live our life. And you said earlier in the episode that we sometimes talk about our loved ones in the past tense, and that's probably proper because there was a time that we had in the in our a course of relationship that the death is the end, and so it becomes a past tense. And yet, at the same time, our loved one is still alive. They're still with us in that Christian sense, anyway. Speaking of Christ still being with us. So it's something interesting that we talk about, and you may want to comment on this, but after Jesus died, the disciples kind of went into hiding, and they were all in despair after that horrible Good Friday act, that criminal's death. And for about 50 days or so, the Bible tells us, until Pentecost, they were kind of hiding in a room. They were undercover, and they were afraid. They were afraid for so many things, afraid for their lives even. And yet, at some point, at the point that we call Pentecost, the 50th day, this Holy Spirit comes upon them, and they get a whole new sense of life. And they realize that they didn't really know this Jesus. The apostles who knew him better than anybody, didn't really know him at all. And now they're learning all kinds of things about him, and it gives them a new courage and new life and new vitality to go out. And I'll hear this a lot at funeral wakes where people will say, well, I didn't know that about my dad. They love hearing the stories of the people that come through the line because they'll tell them more things about their loved one. They thought, well, I didn't know that. Or I thought I knew this person, but I didn't really know this person. And sometimes we who know the deceased better than anybody, we don't really know them. And yet in this other phase of life that is after the earthly death, there's another life that is coming to life in us where we know them in a whole new way. And it gives us, like it gave the disciples, new courage and new vitality and new life to go out and share and to live our lives differently because of the new life that we have in our loved one, our person, who in the past tense is dead, but in our life is a living presence. Does that resonate a little bit?
Absolutely. One of the beliefs that we have is that there are two deaths. One is the physical death of a person, and the second death is when we stop talking about them. So we encourage our members to keep their persons very much alive, to share stories about their person, to for example, my father, my mother, I talk about them today with my family. I make my father's favorite meal that nobody likes during one of our holidays.
That's awesome.
I just go through the routine.
That's how you get everybody to remember him, though, right, Fran?
Exactly.
Remember this dish. Here we go. Well, that's so true. I'm actually really glad that you brought that up because I think, I don't know if it's natural or normal, but maybe there is a tendency over time, as time drifts by, that we can forget to some degree.
But I think
it's up to us to keep remembering and to keep sharing those stories.
Right.
I mean, our children will only know them through those of us who tell them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also, I'm so glad you said that, Fran. I may have to have you say it again because I really believe, and I don't know if it's society that we feel conditioned, maybe it's that we're uncomfortable, but we have this idea that you shouldn't talk about them because it's going to make them uncomfortable. But that's actually the thing they want more than anything.
Yeah, and Kelly, I think, as we talked about that most people are very well-intended and, they want to be there to help and they want to be supportive. I think as time goes by, most people become very uncomfortable bringing up someone's person because they themselves are afraid of evoking emotions that they themselves don't know how to react to.
Oh, that's
So-
interesting.
so-
Yeah. That's
For example, sometimes I'll talk about my father or those that have gone before me, and I'll get teary-eyed, and people don't know what to do about them, but do about my feelings. They want to start comforting me. I don't need the comfort.
mhm.
I'm sharing, love that I have.
Right.
But others become uncomfortable with those emotions.
Why do you think that
they
is,
don't-
friend? What did you just say there? Because we haven't dealt. Were you saying that a lot of people haven't dealt with those emotions themselves, so therefore they're uncomfortable when somebody else displays them?
I don't. Even if they've dealt with it, I don't know if they know how to embrace or receive the emotions of the person grieving a year later or 2 years later.
Well, Father, you see that all the time, don't you? With, just the day-to-day things that you deal with,
I do, but again, I think it has to do with all of us dealing with things differently. For a number of people, that anniversary of death is a very important thing, and the family will come back together a year later and might dedicate something or launch something in honor of their loved one or do something. But yeah, keeping the memory alive is a very beautiful, powerful, wonderful thing, and we all do those things differently.
I've heard people say, well, I don't want to remind them of their grief. Well, candidly, I'm not going to forget that my mother, my father, and my sister have died. So you talking about them is not going to make me forget that they're not here or remember that they're not here, is what I'm saying.
I personally find it
part
like
of me.
if somebody talks about my dad or, maybe, hey, when he retired, he worked at a golf course and there's a lot of people he touched there as just a starter, but he had a great way of connecting with people. And occasionally, even now, a couple of years later, I'll still run into somebody, I knew your dad from Glen Oaks, and they'll talk about him. And I find that, I really enjoy that. And it just reminds me of what a great man he really was. And so I see what you're saying. Be more aware of that, audience, in terms of, it is a positive thing, and we should be able to express our emotions. And I think you're saying, Fran, most people are going to, not everyone, but
most people will shy away from reminding somebody of a particular day.
right.
If you have a friend and what day their mother's birthday is, who is no longer with them, it's I think for most a really good thing to say, hey, I remember it's your mom's birthday today. Let's make her favorite cake.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
I love that. I think it's marvelous. Fran, do you mind? This might be switching it just a little bit, but as we are alive, we usually think of death as a bad word or a bad thing, or at least a lot of families don't even like to talk about it or think about it, or let's not go there. And I've found, again, from my priesthood, that those families and households that talk about death as a part of life and a natural part of life tend to handle the inevitable, that is the death of the loved one, in a much healthier way. I know that sometime in our modern times anyway, we have our advanced directives and we do our funeral planning and we talk about things quite openly. At least part of the population does, and it's probably becoming more and more and more. But there are those that just find it to be such a dirty word and an evil thing, and let's not even go there. We're alive. I can't stand to talk about it. I can't stand to think about it. Do you have any sense for our listeners about, if is it better? Is it healthier, as I think it is, to and you don't have to agree with me on this, but is it better to talk about all this openly? Does it put us in a better place when things happen? And for those households who are just shaped in a way that they just don't even want to talk about death, is that okay? Or is it like anything else? We'll have to grieve the way that we want to, or we'll deal with it when we have to?
So that can open an entirely new conversation. There
Totally
is
different
research.
podcast. Okay, all right.
There
Yeah.
is
Sorry to get into
research.
it.
I'll see if I can be brief on this and bring it back to grief as you asked. So there is research that suggests, and part of it is in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's research, that those who are dying and talk about their death and unburden themselves with things that they need or want to say, the conversations that maybe were never had, have a much easier transition, and their transition is less agitated than their counterparts who don't. That's research. Now, bringing it to grief. It is the experience of my community overall that when death is spoken about and wishes are clearly expressed, that actually becomes a gift to the people that are grieving. Because when you're grieving after a death loss, you want to know how to honor your person's death, how to honor their wishes. And we've seen so many inter-family fightings because wishes weren't expressed and articulated, that interferes with the grieving process. It delays it. It adds more complication on it. And then there are subsequent processes to grief with the inner fighting, that it takes so much longer to become at peace and begin that journey of grief.
Well, you summarized that pretty well, pretty quickly, and thank you, because I do think it's such an important thing for listeners out there to understand that there is a difference. And if we embrace this kind of a conversation earlier, it tends to work out better later.
Death is part of life, and I found out two things. Well, actually, I found out one very significant thing, and I've shared another with my family. Just because of my the difference in my age with my husband, on a natural course of life, if he should precede me, we're Jewish. I thought we were going to have a Jewish deli for his wake. Instead, I found out he wants Chinese food. I'm so glad we had that conversation, and I'm going to get that right. The second thing is, my favorite color is cobalt blue. My coffin is going to be lined in cobalt blue. Anybody that comes to pay tribute, my family knows they need to come with something cobalt blue. And
I'm glad you brought that up, Fran. Duly noted.
I hope that when my children and family sees cobalt blue, they're going to smile and say, "That's Mom."
Hey, Fran, I would love for you just to share really quick, if someone, is obviously inspired by what you've been sharing and they feel that they're in this grief journey and they don't know where to turn, and you talked about the word isolation, and they're looking for a connection, how can they reach you and be a part of what you're doing?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So the website, which really is the starting point, is healgrief.org. And on the homepage, if you just scroll down, you'll come across the Actively Moving Forward app. Although anybody can download the app and access our resources, to actually interact with our community members, one must register. Then you're able to participate in our community, which would mean connecting with other members in our community. We have thousands of members at this particular point. Accessing our resources, we send out daily inspirational quotes. and we offer the opportunity to sign up for virtual support groups. I want to emphasize that all of this is no charge to our members. We really try to embody the meaning of service in our 501c3 status as a nonprofit. So accessing the app, downloading it, accessing the tools and the virtual support, there is no fee. We do have one program that we've recently added, which is one-on-one with a HealGrief coach. That is our only fee-based program, and it's not an insignificant cost, but relative to any professional services that you would go to help you in support, it is significantly less. So HealGrief.org, it is called the Actively Moving Forward app. And again, just to emphasize, to interact with the community, one must register, and you can do that through links on HealGrief.org.
Well, Fran, I know Kelly and I have obviously been very inspired by you and your organization and what you're doing and your vision. But can you? I'd love to hear, what is your big vision with HealGrief? Like, where do you see all this going? I know you're touching lives all over the world now. What more do you want to do with this?
Yeah, so we're touching lives all over the world with people calling in from South Korea, from Ukraine, actually, from India.
That's really cool.
But we're only able to serve them in English and in our time zone. So the goal would be to expand into other languages to actually become more universal in our ability to serve. And to have satellites throughout the world where time zones do not become an issue for those who are not available in hours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see where that would be a big challenge.
You know, I just want to comment on that too. I suspect that in our Western world, the United States, we're probably one of the worst for how we deal with death. And so many other cultures and so many other nations have very powerful and beautiful and wonderful ways of celebrating life. And I think we're getting better at it. And it just as you've commented, Fran, too, on the cobalt blue or the reception after your husband's funeral, it's not going to be the deli, but the Chinese buffet. You know, those kind of things help us to celebrate life rather than to just mourn death, just to have a burial. It really is about we're all here for a short time. We have an impact that we can make, and we ought to gather and celebrate that. But I think in this international outreach that you're doing, I think it also helps us to realize as different cultures do different things, there are great ways to celebrate our existence together as a people of God on the global earth.
So true. And Father, you know, I do believe things are changing. I was recently at a funeral in a church where after services, they invited everybody up to have some champagne around the casket.
Love it.
That's great. Yeah.
Wow.
And it was the Seed and Savor champagne.
That's really cool.
A little different than what many have experienced, but I think that was truly an on-the-spot tribute and how things are changing in the way we want to celebrate someone's life.
Yeah, that's cool.
Hey, Fran, I've just got one last question for you. I would love to ask your definition of forgiveness. What does that look like?
Put her on the spot.
And, well, I mean, what does that look like and feel like to you?
Okay, Kelly's very different than a few years ago and constantly evolving as I hold the space for people who are grieving. And a lot of this is a result of the conversation we had. I have learned that I want to love those I care for much more deeply. I want to forgive more quickly. And I want to be as present in the moment as possible because the next breath is not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can have a daily reminder through the work that I do of those three things on how I want to live my life, not only has my life become more fulfilled, I anticipate it to become even more fulfilling. I have learned to kind of refocus my energy on those who I love that love me, and just push by the wayside on the shoreline, the things that don't matter as much. The forgiveness is not only selfish, it's selfless. If I should not have my breath tomorrow, I would never want anyone I love to think I've left them in anger. And that is why, for me, the forgiveness is so important.
No, I love that, Fran. Thank you for sharing that.
And to be present.
Yeah.
And to be present.
To be present. Well, it's easy to say, but it's not always easily done. But that was amazing, Fran, and thank you for just everything you shared. I know Father is going to end us in prayer before he does. Audience, again, we're visiting with Fran Solomon, and her organization is healgrief.org, and you can go to HealGrief and find out all the amazing resources that Fran and her team make available. But Fran, this has just been such a pleasure. I know we could keep talking for a long time. I really was engaged with everything that you were saying, and I love what you're doing, and I just love your spirit and your heart and your vision for your organization. So keep going. I know Kelly and I can't wait to see just what continues to transpire with HealGrief.
And
Thank you
Fran,
so
I'll
much. Thank
echo
you.
onto that too. Yeah, and just offer my the thoughts too. It's just been remarkable. Appreciate the enlivening conversation, and as Robert has indicated, we could go on, and hopefully you'll come back, and we can maybe take on some of these other topics another time. I'm just going to
That would be my pleasure.
Oh, terrific. I'm just going to conclude with this little a prayer or poem. A lot of the listeners have heard it before. It's Henry Scott Holland, a canonist, but it's on death that is beyond the horizon. Some people just call it death is nothing at all. But as I'm listening to some of the beautiful stories that you tell that make us smile and enliven our hearts like champagne around the casket, they do help us to look at our own grief a little bit differently. But his words are these, and I won't read all of them, but some of them. Death is nothing at all. I've only slipped away into the next room. Everything remains as it was. I am I, and you are you. The old life that we lived so fondly together, it still remains unchanged, untouched. Whatever we were to each other, that we still are. So just call me by my old familiar name and speak to me in that easy way you always did. Put no difference in your tone, wear no forced air of solemnity or sorrow, but laugh as we always laughed at the little jokes that we enjoyed together. Play, smile, ponder it, think of me, pray for me. Let my name be ever the household word that it always was. Let it be spoken without an effect, without a ghost of shadow upon it, for life means all that it ever meant. It's the same as it always was. There is unbroken continuity. Why should I be out of mind just because I'm out of sight? Know that I'm waiting for you for an interval, perhaps sometime very near, just around the corner. I want you to know all is well.
That's beautiful. Before we close, I'm just going to go ahead and make a decision for the entire group that our hope for ourselves and our audience is that we all would be willing to forgive more quickly.
Well, thank you, honey. I'll take a note of that. That sounds amazing. I need to do the same thing. We all do. And as Kelly said, everyone, our audience, we welcome you guys in, and we're very grateful for you on each and every episode. And, our intention with this podcast, again, is to bring awareness and bring optionality in your life and bring hope. And if we can do that through these lively conversations and people like Fran Solomon who are willing to donate her time and her wisdom with us, we give thanks for that. And we give thanks for you being here on each and every episode. So, Fran, thank you again. And it was just amazing to be with you today. And let us know what we can do for you, obviously, at HealGrief, and keep us up to date on all your great endeavors. And I just can't wait to see how things continue to progress for you and everyone out there. Thanks again for being here today. And we can't wait to join you again on our next episode of Time for Forgiveness. Until then, live with passion. Thank you.